Hello, neighbors. Before we get into the episode, just a couple quick things I'd like to mention. If you go to the podcast website, neighborontheleft.com, there's a whole bunch of things for you to check out there, including the contacts page, where you can see all of the social media links. And these days, I do post a lot of stuff just about daily on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. A lot of interesting stuff there. If you stop by, please like, share, and follow if you would. Also on the website, there is the episodes section where you can download or stream any episode of the podcast going all the way back to the beginning. And of course, the blog section. I make a post for every episode of the podcast, and it includes all of the sources that I use. All right, let's start the episode. So I'm going to start off by asking you to create a mental picture. I want you to picture a Republican congressional candidate standing on a stage juggling. And some of the things in the air are tennis balls. Tennis balls labeled communism. That's a nice, easy toss. Trans athletes. Got it. Voter fraud. Right back up there. Woke schools, crime, immigration, radical Democrats. These are all familiar objects. Republicans have practiced with these. They know the talking points. They know where the applause lines are. They know which words make Fox News Chiron writers reach lovingly for the caps lock key. But mixed in with the tennis balls are knives. Donald Trump's approval rating, knife. Iran war, knife. Rising prices, knife. The economy, knife. The Republican record after controlling Washington, big knife. Hold the House, hold the Senate, keep MAGA happy, win swing voters who are increasingly unhappy with things. At this point, we're approaching chainsaw territory. And standing just off stage is Donald Trump, which is important because every 2 days, Trump wanders into the act, picks up something sharp, and says essentially, "Hey, are you juggling this one yet?" And suddenly, some Republican running in a competitive district has to explain whatever the president said or threatened or posted or renamed or bombed or pardoned or invented since the last time they checked their phone. And this would all be kind of funny if the numbers weren't giving Republican campaign managers night sweats. The latest Reuters Ipsos poll has Trump's approval at 33%. The lowest Reuters Ipsos has measured in either of his presidencies. Democrats now have a narrow advantage over Republicans on who Americans trust more to handle the economy, 38 to 35, and on immigration, where Republicans had a staggering 26-point advantage at the beginning of Trump's second term, and that lead has shrunken to 2 points. And then there's Iran. 80% of Americans in that same polling expect this war to drag on. The war has helped push energy prices higher, and only about 1 in 5 Americans say that it's still worth the cost. So if you're a Republican candidate right now, you have a problem. You need to keep all of those knives in the air, but you would much rather spend the next 11 weeks showing everybody the tennis balls. Welcome to the GOP Midterm Juggling Act. Hello, neighbors, and welcome to Your Neighbor on the Left, the podcast about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. I am Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today, we're talking about the Republican Party's midterm problem. And more specifically, the political juggling act they have created for themselves by spending years wrapping the entire party around Donald Trump, and then discovering that heading into November anyway, a whole lot of voters are not especially thrilled with Donald Trump. Now, one caveat right off the bat, and I'm not going to belabor this, I'll just say it once. I am not predicting some gigantic Democratic landslide in November. 11 weeks is a long time in politics. Candidates matter, districts matter, things happen. And if there is one political skill Democrats have demonstrated with astonishing consistency, it's the ability to find a rake in an otherwise empty yard and step directly on it. Okay, caveat made, because what interests me right now is not predicting the final score. It's watching Republicans decide what game they want voters to think they're playing. Their first ever midterm convention is coming in September, and Axios reports that a major part of the strategy will be making the case that Democrats have been captured by socialists and the activist left. And that gets us to the real question of this episode. What election do Republicans desperately want Americans to be thinking about? And maybe more importantly, what election are they desperately trying not to have? Because if November becomes a simple performance review of Donald Trump and Republican control of Washington, that's one hell of a knife to have to keep in the air. Okay, so here's where I think we have to begin. Because Republicans didn't wake up one morning and discover that Donald Trump had somehow become attached to their party like some sort of political barnacle. They built this. And they did it deliberately for years. Donald Trump didn't hijack some healthy, independent Republican Party while everybody was out getting coffee. Republican voters chose him. Republican politicians accommodated him. Republican candidates begged for his endorsement. Republican office holders learned very quickly that criticizing him could mean a primary challenge, a public humiliation campaign, a nickname, a truth social tantrum, or all four before we even get to lunch. And gradually, loyalty to Trump stopped being merely one consideration inside Republican politics. It became a credential, sometimes the credential. You could be conservative on taxes, conservative on abortion, on guns, on immigration, on judges. But if Donald J. Trump decided you were disloyal, congratulations, you were now considered a rhino. Apparently, decades of conservative credentials can be revoked by one man with his iPhone. And Republicans went along with this. Not all of them happy, not all of them privately, but politically, they went along with it. They defended him when he attacked other Republicans. They defended him when he attacked judges, when he attacked prosecutors, when he attacked election officials, when he attacks members of his own administration. They defended him when he attacked Republicans who had the gall to suggest that maybe Donald Trump should occasionally be told the word no. And over time, the message became pretty unmistakable. Trump is this party. This is Trump's party. Not the party where Trump happens to be president, not the party where Trump happens to be the most popular politician. This is Trump's party. That branding was not exactly subtle. Republican candidates ran ads trying to out-Trump each other. They competed over who loved him more. They sought his endorsement like it came with a free Senate seat. They showed up at rallies, they repeated his language, they defended his grievances, and they adopted his enemies. And if Trump decided some Republican had betrayed him, well, suddenly that Republican's lifetime voting record didn't matter. Not nearly as much as whether they had adequately kissed the ring. This is important because now we are getting close to the midterms, and some Republican candidates would very much like to perform a small magic trick. They would like Donald Trump to remain the unquestioned leader of the Republican Party, while also asking voters not to judge them by Donald Trump. That is spectacular. That is like spending 10 years painting your house bright orange and then complaining that Zillow keeps describing it as orange when you're trying to sell it. You chose the color. You bought the paint. You invited the neighborhood over to watch you paint it. You put up a sign saying proudly orange. And now the realtor says, a lot of buyers are turned off by the color. And suddenly everybody's saying, well, technically the house has many other features. Yes, it does. We could see the kitchen, we could see the garage, we can also see the giant orange wall you spent a decade insisting was the entire point. And this is where Republican midterm problems become so beautifully self-inflicted. Because if Donald Trump were simply an unpopular president whom congressional Republicans had regularly challenged, this would be a whole lot easier for them. A Republican candidate could say, I agree with him on some things, I disagree with him on others, judge me on my own record. And that would be perfectly normal. Presidents and members of Congress disagree all the time. But Republicans have spent years making disagreement itself suspicious. Trump didn't merely demand support, he demanded loyalty. And Republicans repeatedly reinforced the idea that loyalty mattered. So now, when a vulnerable Republican candidate tries to create some distance, they can't create too much distance, because then MAGA notices, and Trump notices, and the conservative media ecosystem notices. And suddenly, the candidate who desperately wants suburban voters to think of them as an independent-minded local representative has to worry that Donald Trump might decide they are insufficiently enthusiastic and blow up their campaign from his phone. Which brings us to the first knife in this juggling act. Donald Trump himself. Not just the man, the whole political structure Republicans built around him. The loyalty test, the endorsements, the punishments, the expectation that Republican office holders must defend him. The assumption that an attack on Trump is an attack on the party. All of that sounded great when Trump was politically useful, but there's a downside to attaching your entire political identity to one guy. You also get attached to his numbers. And right now, those numbers aren't so great. So let's start with the obvious one here. Donald Trump's approval rating. The latest Reuters Ipsos number is 33%. 33. That is not a number Republican strategists are printing on tote bags and flyers. And the problem is not simply that Democrats dislike Donald Trump. Of course, Democrats dislike Donald Trump. That's not news. The problem is that Republicans need to win people who are not committed MAGA voters, independents, suburban voters, people who may have voted Republican before, but are really unhappy now. People who do not spend 6 hours a day thinking about politics. People whose political ideology is basically something like, I would like groceries to cost less and everyone on television to shut the hell up. Those voters matter. And a president sitting at 33% approval is not exactly a helpful wind at your back. Then, of course, there is Iran. Another knife, a very, very sharp one, because Republican candidates did not get to choose the war. They did not individually decide how long it would last. They didn't decide military moves. They don't control diplomacy. But they are still running under the same party label as the president who's conducting the war. And they have spent years portraying Donald Trump as the guy who would bring strength and peace and deals and an end to endless wars. So when voters decide they don't like the war, Republican candidates inherit the question. Do you think Trump is handling Iran well? Knife. Do you think this war has been worth the cost? Knife. How much longer should it continue? Knife. What do you say to voters paying more because energy prices have risen? Big knife. And this is where you start seeing why the tennis balls become so attractive. Because imagine you are that Republican candidate and a reporter says, Congressman, do you support the president's handling of Iran? And somewhere inside your campaign office, 20 people simultaneously open a bottle of Tums. Because there may not be a safe answer to that question. If you say yes, then you own it. If you say no, Trump will hear about it. If you refuse to answer, then that becomes the story. So maybe you say, well, what voters in my district are really concerned about is securing the border. And there it is. Knife in, tennis ball out. But we'll come back to that, because Iran is not the only knife. There's affordability, there is rising prices, the economy in general, and here again, the politics are uncomfortable because Republicans control Washington, and that matters. When you are the opposition party, you get to say, look what the people in charge have done. When you are the party in charge, eventually someone says, well, okay, what have you done? And that's where campaign rhetoric gets a bit less fun. Republicans can talk about how terrible Democratic economic policies would be. They can talk about taxes and regulation and socialism, and they harp about California. They can talk about some Democratic proposal that has not passed and may never pass and probably exists mostly as fundraising email. But voters have this irritating habit of also noticing the government that currently exists. And right now, Republicans control it. So if people remain unhappy about affordability, the conversation gets awkward really, really quickly, because the answer cannot forever be, but Joe Biden. At some point, the statute of limitations on that political credit card expires. You have the White House, you have Congress, you have been telling everyone how completely in control you are. Well, great. Then explain the bill. And this is where another contradiction enters into the act. Republicans want credit for all the stuff voters like, but when voters dislike something, suddenly government becomes incredibly complicated. The president can't control everything. Congress has limits. Markets are complicated. Global events matter, and there's supply chains and energy markets and international pressures. And just to be clear, all of that can be true. Economies are extremely complicated. Presidents don't control every price. But I would just like everyone to remember that principle the next time Republicans blame a Democrat for the price of eggs within 12 minutes of inauguration. Apparently, economic complexity is one of those concepts that enters hibernation whenever the other party holds the White House. And then we have the Republican governing record itself, another knife, because midterms aren't theoretical. You have been governing, you have votes, you have policies and budgets and executive actions out the wazoo, and you have consequences. And the more voters are asked to evaluate what Republicans have actually done with power, the less useful it is to spend all your time describing the horrifying communist dystopia that Democrats might someday create. That is the basic asymmetry here. Look what Democrats might do is hypothetical. Look what Republicans have done is retrospective. One of those conversations is much easier to control. And then hovering over the entire act are two giant knives that make all of the others matter even more, the House and the Senate. Because this is not merely about a bunch of politicians wanting to keep their offices. Control of Congress determines what Trump can do for the rest of his term. Legislation, budgets, oversights, investigations, subpoenas, confirmations, judges, the entire balance of power in Washington. So yeah, Republican candidates are worried about their own races, but the party is also trying to protect the governing structure that Donald Trump depends on. Which means the Juggling Act gets more ridiculous. Keep Trump happy, keep MAGA happy, keep independents happy, defend the administration, distance yourself from the administration, run on the record, don't let the election become all about the record, talk about national issues, wait, localize the race, be a proud Trump Republican. Also, please stop asking me about Donald Trump. At some point, this stops looking like a campaign strategy and starts looking like Cirque du Soleil rehearsing with a malpractice attorney waiting in the wings. And we haven't even gotten to the tennis balls yet. So, and I think this is the really fun part, because a Republican running in a competitive district has to communicate several ideas at the same time. Donald Trump is a historic president. I strongly support Donald Trump. Donald Trump's agenda is working. And also, please judge me independently of Donald Trump. I represent this district. I care about local issues. I'm focused on your family. I am my own man or woman or whatever sufficiently Trump-approved autonomous organism happens to be running. This is not, for the most part, Republicans suddenly repudiating Trump. That would be much simpler. A Republican could walk up to the microphone and say, I think the president is insane. I think he screwed this up. There, distance achieved. That's not the maneuver. The maneuver is much more delicate. They want electoral distance without political separation. Reuters was reporting this back in April. Republican strategists were already looking for ways to campaign on things they considered Trump policy successes while putting less emphasis on Trump himself, particularly in competitive races, local issues, taxes, affordability. The part of the agenda candidates thought they could sell without turning every congressional race into a referendum on the guy in the Oval Office, which is quite a trick. The policies are Trump, the successes are Trump, the movement is Trump, the party is Trump, but the election, whoa. Why are you bringing Trump into this? This is about potholes and farm subsidies and whether the bridge on Route 61 gets repaired. Please stop trying to politicize this congressional election by talking about the president of the United States. And it gets even better because the candidate still needs the MAGA voters. You can't walk into a general election and say, okay, thanks for the primary, everybody. I'm going to put the red hat in a drawer now and pretend we never met. Those voters are essential for a Republican candidate. You need them excited. You need them pissed off. You need them donating and volunteering and showing up. And Trump remains the dominant Republican political figure. So now our juggler has two particularly nasty knives in the rotation. One says, keep MAGA happy. And the other says, win people who can't stand MAGA. That is fantastic. Imagine trying to sell a restaurant simultaneously to people who demand ghost pepper wings and people who say ghost pepper makes them sick. Your menu is going to be an absolute freaking adventure. And Republicans have yet another problem. Donald Trump pays attention almost obsessively. If a vulnerable candidate tries to create too much distance, Trump is not exactly known for saying, oh, I completely understand. Different districts require different political strategies, and I wish my fellow Republican the best. No. Donald Trump treats personal loyalty the way a medieval king treated tribute. You either brought enough or somebody starts asking uncomfortable questions about how your head is attached. So the candidate has to keep reassuring MAGA, I'm with Trump, while reassuring everyone else, but I'm not, with Trump. And that gives us one of my favorite pieces of campaign language. When you hear them say things like, I'm focused on the issues people in my district care about. Now, sometimes that means exactly what it says. Members of Congress should care about their districts. But in this particular environment, sometimes I hear that and my internal translator spits out, I have seen the president's polling. We need to localize this race. Translates into, please stop asking our candidate about Donald Trump. I'm focused on kitchen table issues. Translates into, can we please find a table that does not have Iran sitting in the middle of it? And none of this means every Republican is doomed. It means they have created a balancing act where doing the thing necessary to satisfy one group of voters can make the pitch to the other group it considerably harder, to say it mildly. That is the pretzel. Love Trump, need Trump, defend Trump, run with Trump, but depending on the district, maybe stand a little farther away in the photograph. And once you understand that problem, the campaign strategy starts making a whole lot more sense. Because if the knives are uncomfortable, then you need to find something else to juggle. Give the audience something easier to watch. And we don't even have to speculate much about this. In July, Axios quoted a Republican connected to Trump's political operation describing the coming midterms in this way: voters have to hate the Dems more than they hate us. Well, there you go. That may be the most refreshingly candid campaign strategy I've ever heard in my life. Not convince the voters that we have governed well, not show them how much better their lives are, not even give them a compelling vision of the next 2 years, none of that. Just make the other guys more disgusting. And politically, that can work. This is not complicated. If voters dislike you, you have two choices. You can make them like you more, or you can make them like the other guy less. Option 2 can be considerably easier. And that is where the tennis balls come flying in. Communism, toss. Socialism, toss. Transgender athletes, toss. Election fraud, woke schools, dangerous democratic cities, radical leftists, all these tennis balls. Now, and I want to be careful here because this distinction matters. I'm not saying that Republicans secretly believe none of this. I'm not saying every politician who talks about immigration or crime or transgender policy is sitting in a back room cackling, excellent, the diversion is proceeding exactly as planned. They may sincerely care about those issues, and their voters may sincerely care. Some of these are legitimate policy debates. But politics is also about emphasis, what gets talked about and how often and when. And what conveniently stops being talked about when something else takes over the conversation is important. That's what I'm asking you to watch. Not merely what are they talking about. Ask why this topic, why now? And what were they talking about 30 seconds ago? Because timing matters. If Donald Trump gets another ugly poll on affordability Monday morning, and by Monday afternoon, everybody on the right is screaming about trans athlete enrollment in a school district 1,400 miles away, I'm not telling you the second subject is illegitimate automatically. I'm telling you to remember what was on the screen before somebody changed the subject. And Republicans are openly searching for favorable terrain. Just last week, Trump's political advisors reportedly briefed Senate Republicans on internal polling that showed a particular healthcare message tested dramatically better for them than emphasizing the SAVE Act. So what did the advisors recommend? Talk more about healthcare. Of course they did. That's campaigning. You find the message that works. You throw the tennis ball voters seem most interested in catching. What makes this election fascinating is how many subjects Republicans may need to use to prevent the conversation from settling on a relatively simple question. How do you think Republican government is going? Because that question keeps bringing the knives back. If ask about Iran, let's talk about communism. Ask about Trump's approval rating. Did you hear about that trans athlete? Ask about prices. Elections need to be preserved. There's rampant fraud. Ask whether Trump said something completely and utterly unhinged. Have you seen what's happening in Democratic cities? And this is where I want to establish one rule for the rest of this episode. No. I threw you a knife. You don't get to hand me back a tennis ball and pretend that we completed some sort of conversational transaction. Answer the question. Then we can talk about your tennis ball. And in some cases, I'm perfectly willing to talk about it, which brings us to crime and immigration, because those two subjects are different. Those are real issues. And I think liberals make a mistake when they respond to every Republican discussion of crime or immigration by acting like the underlying issue isn't important. Crime matters. People have a right to be safe. Immigration policy matters. Countries have a right to have borders and enforce them. Governments decide who may legally enter and remain. Those are not inherently MAGA positions. Those are things that governments do. So if Republicans want to talk about crime, fine, let's talk about crime. but we're going to talk about the whole subject. Trump has recently been emphasizing crime as a midterm issue, and there is an immediate complication to this. New FBI figures show violent crime fell significantly in 2025. That doesn't mean crime disappeared. It doesn't mean every city is safe. It doesn't mean every community experienced the same trend. It does mean that if you're going to build a national campaign around the idea that America is experiencing some unprecedented explosion of violent crime, somebody is allowed to bring the actual crime statistics into the conversation. That's called the follow-up question. And I'm going to say this right now. By and large, the reporters that I see, especially when they're questioning Trump or a high-level official, these reporters suck at the follow-up questions. Sometimes they don't exist at all. But anyway, let's go farther on this. When Republicans say law and order, I have some questions about both the law and the order. For example, how does tough on crime work with Donald Trump's pardon record? Can I bring up Trevor Milton? Milton founded Nikola, an electric truck company. He was convicted of fraud after prosecutors accused him of misleading investors about the company's technology. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison, and then Donald Trump pardoned him. And here's the interesting detail. Milton and his wife had donated more than $1.8 million to Trump's reelection efforts less than a month before the 2024 election. Now, let me be very precise. I'm not saying that donation bought the pardon. I mean, I can't prove that. What I'm saying is that if you're building your political identity around law and order, I'm absolutely entitled to notice when a wealthy political donor convicted of fraud receives presidential mercy. Especially because Milton is not, like some bizarre one-off story. Reuters investigated Trump's second-term clemency operation and found that clemency recipients or their associates had donated more than $10 million to Trump-aligned political efforts. Reuters also found a pardon process that increasingly operated through Trump allies and personal connections rather than primarily through the traditional Justice Department process. And again, it's not proof that pardons were sold, but it does create one hell of a follow-up question for the party of law and order. Because apparently there is tough on crime, and then there is tough on crime, terms and conditions apply. Please ask whether defendant has access to the president. So when somebody says Democrats are soft on criminals, my response is, okay, which criminals? Because that seems to matter a lot right now. Shoplifter, throw the book at him. Undocumented immigrant, deport him. Financial fraudster with political connections, well, now we apparently need to have a nuanced conversation about prosecutorial overreach and the majestic constitutional tradition of executive clemency. It's funny how nuance keeps showing up at exactly the right dinner parties. And then we get to incarceration itself, because lock 'em up is a slogan that we all have heard and remember, but locking people up requires places to put them, people who operate those places, contracts, money, and increasingly in immigration detention, enormous amounts of all of those things. The Government Accountability Office data shows ICE's authorized detention facilities expanded from 134 in January of 2025 to 239 by April of 2026. That's a 78% increase in the number of authorized facilities. The average daily detained population grew about 39,000 more to 67,000, an increase of 71%. And ICE was planning a new $38 billion acquisition approach to continuing expanding detention capacity. That's not some tiny side business we're talking about that's attached to immigration enforcement. It's an enormous detention system, and private companies are a part of it. GEO Group and CoreCivic operate immigration detention facilities under government contracts, which means there are corporations whose revenue increases when government purchases more detention capacity. That does not automatically mean every detention decision is motivated by profit. It does mean profit exists in the system. And if we're going to have a serious conversation about immigration, that most certainly belongs in that conversation. And so does oversight. GAO looked at Camp East Montana, ICE's largest detention facility, and found millions of dollars in waste because the contract required the government to pay operational and meal costs based on a capacity for 5,000 detainees, even when the facility was holding fewer. And at the end of February, it was only holding around 1,600 people. Process that in your mind for a second. We're paying for 5,000 even though they only have 1,600 people. That is a hell of a business model. Imagine opening a restaurant where the government agrees to pay you for 5,000 diners every night, whether 5,000 people show up or only 1,600 people show up. While we're on the subject, I would like to announce my strong support for border security. Please send contract. And oversight concerns are not theoretical. A court-appointed monitor reported last month that California's largest immigration detention center, operated by CoreCivic, was failing across all 8 areas of healthcare the federal court has required it to address. Now, CoreCivic said it was reviewing the report and emphasized its commitment to detainee health and safety. DHS said detainees receive medical care and that facilities are regularly inspected. Okay, good. That is the argument. Now we're actually talking about immigration policy. Not the bumper sticker, not the campaign ad, not the policy. Who gets detained, where, under what conditions, who's getting paid, what oversight exists, what happens when the government gets it wrong, what happens when the people enforcing these policies behave badly. What happens when an agent is masked? ICE says its officers wear masks because of threats of doxing against them and their families. Well, okay, that's their explanation. Then the second question is, what safeguards ensure accountability when the person exercising government policing power has obscured their identity? How are you dealing with that? That is not an anti-law enforcement question. That is a government accountability question. If someone has the authority to stop you and restrain you and transport you and maybe in the near future shock you with electrified gloves, I think asking how that person is identified and held responsible is fairly freaking reasonable. And this is what I mean when I say crime and immigration may begin as tennis balls. Republicans like those subjects. They poll well for them. They have practiced the answers and they know the slogans. But when you keep asking questions, suddenly that nice soft tennis ball can get a little bit heavier. Private detention contractors, pardons, donors, oversight, conditions, due process, accountability, and eventually the candidate is staring at the thing in their hands and thinking, a minute ago this was a tennis ball. When did it turn into a bowling ball? That's why the first question is enough, because anybody can answer, are you tough on crime? Of course they are. Everybody's tough on crime in a campaign commercial. Everybody supports secure borders in a 30-second ad. The interesting part begins when the slogan ends. And that brings us to the rule I want you to remember through the rest of this campaign is watch the second question. This is more than anything else what I want you to pay attention to between now and November, this second question, because politicians are prepared for the first one. At least good politicians are. There are people whose entire job is to sit in rooms and ask, what if they ask about Iran? What if they ask about Trump's approval rating? What if they ask about prices? What if they ask whether you agree with whatever Trump posted the Truth Social at 3:00 this morning? And then they develop an answer. It not necessarily an answer to the question, but an answer. And we know, anybody who's watching knows that those are two different things. If somebody asks, do you think President Trump has handled Iran well? The candidate may say, I believe America must always protect strength, and the president has made clear that Iran will never be allowed to threaten the United States. That sounds awesome. It sounds very patriotic. Flags waving, eagles flying overhead, a small child salutes. But that wasn't the damn question. The question was, do you think He has handled Iran well. So ask it again. That's the moment I want you watching. And I pray every night before I go to bed, God bless my loved ones and peace on earth. And please, dear Lord, let these reporters learn to ask follow-up questions that matter. The first answer may tell you what the campaign wants to say. The second question tells you whether the candidate is willing to answer. And there are only so many things you can do when somebody refuses to let you pivot. You can answer, you can repeat yourself, you can attack the premise, you can attack the interviewer, you can attack Democrats. You can suddenly discover that voters in your district are much more interested in something else. Or you can perform one of my favorite political maneuvers, the aggressive non-answer. That's when the politician looks deeply offended that anyone would expect them to respond to words that just came out of the interviewer's mouth. Who loves this particular tactic? Congressman, do you agree with the president? Well, I think what's really offensive here is that nobody in the media wants to talk about what Democrats are doing at the border. Sir, I asked you whether you agree with the president. I didn't ask you to review the network's editorial calendar. And this is where the juggling metaphor is the most useful. You can almost watch the objects change hands. Knife comes in, Trump's approval rating. Candidate catches it. Eyes get large. Then trans athletes. Tennis ball back. No, try again. Knife. What do you say to voters who are unhappy with grocery prices? And the candidate catches it and then yells, voter fraud. Nope, that's still a tennis ball. I know it's softer. I know you like that one better, but we were discussing the knife. And I don't want to pretend this is uniquely Republican behavior. Of course not. Politicians pivot. Democrats pivot. The president pivots like no one ever pivoted before. Campaigns teach candidates to pivot. It's a basic communication strategy. What makes it particularly revealing in this election is the sheer number of subjects Republicans may need to pivot away from while simultaneously insisting everything is going wonderfully. Because there is only so many times you can say the economy is booming while voters tell pollsters they're unhappy about affordability before someone comes and says to you, why aren't people feeling it? And you can only say, Trump is restoring peace through strength. So many times, while most Americans tell pollsters they expect the Iran war to continue for a long time and do not think it has been worth the cost. At some point, second question. And there's another reason I think this matters. A lot of political coverage rewards the first answer. Politician says something, headline gets written, clip gets posted, everyone moves on. But the useful interviewer is the one who says, no, that's not what I asked. Do you support it or not? Is that a yes? Is that a no? And suddenly the prepared paragraph is gone. Now we find out what they are willing to own. So between now and November, listen for that phrase. What voters actually care about. Maybe they're right. Maybe voters really do care about the thing they're about to mention. But before you follow them there, remember where you were in the first place. Because sometimes what voters really care about means please follow me away from that last question. And if the reporter does, then the trick works. Now let's talk about some of the easiest tennis balls in the bucket. And these are different from crime and immigration because, as I said, crime and immigration involve big, complicated policy systems. These next subjects are subjects especially useful because you can often trigger an emotional reaction before the policy discussion even gets started. We'll start with communism. I've already talked about this in other episodes. I'm not going to spend another 20 minutes explaining the difference between communism and socialism and democratic socialism and social democracy and Medicare and public schools and the fire department. We've done all that. The important question here is, why does the Republican Party want this election to be about communism? And we know the answer, because Republicans themselves are preparing to make Democrats' relationship with socialists and the activist left a major theme of their September midterm convention. Again, that does not require some secret memo, saying distract from Trump. But you can infer the political logic without finding Dr. Evil's PowerPoint. Republicans want voters evaluating Democrats, not Republican governments. They don't want their performance to be the thing being judged. They want the voter thinking, what will those scary left-wing people do if they win? Rather than thinking, how do I feel about what the people currently in power have done? That's campaigning 101. And communism is a wonderfully efficient word because it arrives preloaded with, 80 years of American political baggage. You don't have to explain much. You say communist, and for certain people in the audience, the soundtrack from Red Dawn starts playing automatically. Then there's transgender issues. And again, there can be legitimate policy debates, surrounding sports and schools and parental rights and medical rules. Those conversations exist, but here's what I want you watching. Proportion. How much political oxygen does an issue receive compared with the number of people affected? How often does one unusual case become evidence of a national emergency? How quickly does the subject appear after Republicans spend 3 days being asked about something they didn't want to discuss? If the nightly news is filled with Trump's approval rating, Iran and gas prices and affordability, and suddenly Republican candidates across the country can't stop talking about a transgender athlete, I'm not telling you to ignore the athlete. I'm telling you to notice the programming change. Fear is useful, and the more visceral the subject, the less time people spend thinking about spreadsheet problems like, why is the president at 33%? And then, of course, there's voter fraud. And here again, you make the distinction. Election security is real. Of course it is. Every legitimate vote should count. Of course it should. People who are not legally eligible should not vote. Election officials should verify eligibility. Ballots should be secure. Counts should be accurate. None of that is controversial. But there is a giant canyon between election security matters and there is widespread voter fraud determining American elections. That second claim requires evidence, and so far, no one has been able to produce any. Trump has continued pushing election fraud narratives heading into these midterms. In July, he used a nationally televised address to revive claims about stolen elections and alleged systemic voting problems, even as critics warned that he was laying groundwork to challenge the legitimacy of the upcoming election. And politically, voter fraud is an incredibly useful tennis ball. It does several things at once. It tells MAGA voters, you are under attack. It tells Republicans the system is rigged against you. It turns Democrats from political opponents into participants in something sinister or illegal. And it shifts the conversation from, are people unhappy with Republican governance? To instead, can Democrats even win honestly? That's a hell of a change of terrain. And it's why the response can't simply be election fraud is fake. That is too simple. It's too sloppy. The correct response is, what specific fraud are you alleging? How many cases, where, what evidence, what investigation, what court finding, what percentage of the vote, what changed, as far as the result was concerned? That second question, again, because election integrity sounds wonderful. I support election integrity. You support election integrity. Everybody supports election integrity. The interesting part is what the phrase is being used to claim and whether the claim has a chance of surviving. Okay, show me. That's the beauty of the second question. It turns slogans back into propositions, and propositions can be checked. Now, after everything I've said, you may be thinking, if Trump is such a problem for Republicans heading into November, why don't they just distance themselves? Really distance themselves? Because they still need him. And that's what makes this whole thing so magnificently stupid. Trump's approval may be weak with the country overall, but within Republican politics, his power remains enormous. Look at the primaries. Trump targeted Republican incumbents he considered insufficiently loyal. And in several states, they lost. Thomas Massey in Kentucky, in Trump, he backed Ken Paxton against longtime Republican Senator John Cornyn. Ken Paxton, who is the case that you read about first in law school when the subject of political corruption comes up. But Paxton won the runoff. Again, Trump demonstrated that when Republican voters are choosing between Republicans, his endorsement can still be lethal. So imagine you're a Republican candidate in a competitive race. You have two audiences, the general electorate and Donald Trump. One audience may want you to create distance. The other audience may punish you for trying. That's not an easy campaign memo to write. So this is really not a case of the GOP has decided Trump is a loser and is quietly moving on, not remotely. This is the GOP needs everything Trump brings while trying to minimize everything Trump costs. They want Trump voters without Trump's approval rating. They want Trump's fundraising machine without Trump's baggage. They want Trump's endorsement without having to deal with reporters asking, so you agree with everything he said? They want Trump's movement without November becoming a referendum on the man who built the movement. And of course, the biggest knife of all, the knife that really never leaves the rotation, is don't anger Trump. Because Trump has spent years demonstrating that he will intervene in Republican politics when he feels betrayed. So the vulnerable candidate cannot merely ask, what helps me win my district? They also have to say, what will piss off Trump? Picture a campaign meeting, and a strategist says, we need you to establish independence. And the candidate says, okay, great. And the strategist says, but don't criticize Trump. Okay. Emphasize local issues. Okay. But make sure MAGA knows you support the president. Fine. Appeal to moderates. Okay. But don't sound moderate enough that Trump notices. Okay. Anything else? Well, Trump threatened to bomb Oman yesterday. Oh my God. And yes, that actually happened this week. Trump threatened military action against Oman if it interfered with efforts involving shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. Even as the Iran war continued, putting pressure on fuel prices and Republican midterm prospects, imagine being a Republican congressional candidate trying to talk about property taxes, and a reporter walks up and says, do you support the bombing of Oman? And somewhere in the distance, you hear the sound of a campaign manager, hitting the floor. And that wasn't the only one. The other one was that he announced via Truth Social that we're going to pull back on our military cooperation with South Korea because he has a really good relationship with Kim Jong-un. I don't know what you say. I don't know what you say if you're a Republican candidate and somebody says to you, what do you think about that? I don't know how you answer that question without either sounding insane or upsetting Donald Trump. And this is where the entire thing stops being merely funny, because the stakes are enormous. Every seat matters because control of Congress determines what happens during Trump's next term. The House controls legislation and spending and investigations and subpoenas and oversight, and the Senate confirms judges, executive branch officials, other appointments, and whichever party controls those institutions has enormous influence over what Trump can do and what gets investigated and what gets blocked. And Republicans know this. Trump certainly knows this. In fact, he pushed Republicans into an extraordinary mid-decade redistricting effort specifically aimed at protecting the House majority. AP reported in June that Republicans emerged with an advantage from that fight after Trump urged GOP states to redraw maps to reduce the risk of losing seats. That's not the behavior of a party casually assuming November is going to work itself out. They understand the stakes. So add those two enormous knives to the juggling act, the House and the Senate. And now our Republican candidate is not merely trying to save their own political career. They're helping determine whether Trump spends the final 2 years of his presidency with a Republican Congress or with at least one chamber controlled by Democrats and equipped with subpoena power. And this gets us to the real fight underneath the campaign. Not the slogans, not the ads, not the yard signs, not even the candidates themselves. The question. Every election event eventually becomes a question in the voter's mind. Sometimes it's, do you want 4 more years of this? Sometimes, is the other guy too dangerous? Who do you trust on the economy? Which party has made my life better? And heading into the midterm, Republicans desperately need November to be about one question. Democrats desperately need it to be about another question. Republicans need voters walking into the booth thinking, are Democrats too radical, too socialist, too soft on crime, too permissive on immigration, too obsessed with cultural issues, too dangerous to trust with power? If that's the question, if any of those is the question on a voter's mind, Republicans have terrain they understand. They have arguments ready and ads and villains and clips and scary music all queued up. There's probably somebody sitting in an editing bay right now lowering the saturation on a picture of a Democratic candidate and adding red tint behind them. And you know the ad. They want to transform America. They want open borders. They want biological men and women's sports. They want socialism. And then a black and white photograph where the Democrat looks like they've personally arrived to confiscate your lawnmower. Republicans know how to make that election. They have been making versions of it for decades. But Democrats need voters to be asking a very different question. Not what might Republicans say Democrats could do, but what have Republicans actually done? How do you feel about Trump? How do you feel about prices, about Iran, about the economy, about the way this administration uses its power? How do you feel about Republican control of Washington? That's a referendum. And Republicans have very good reasons not to want one. This is why I keep coming back to the Juggling Act, because the tennis balls aren't there by accident. There are some legitimate policy debates. Some are exaggerated. Some are fear campaigns. Some are simply reliable Republican themes. But all of them have one thing in common. They are there to move the voters' attention. And in politics, attention is currency. If I can get you furious about something I am strong on, I have less reason to spend time discussing something I'm weak on. That's not uniquely Republican. It's a campaign strategy. But Republicans right now have a particularly large pile of knives they would rather you stop staring at. So when a Republican candidate spends 10 minutes talking about communism, ask yourself, why are we talking about this? When did the subject become transgender athletes? When did voter fraud suddenly become the urgent crisis of the week or the year? Why now? When crime becomes the dominant message, despite national violent crime trends moving downward, what are they trying to make this election about? And again, do not automatically dismiss issues. That's not the lesson. The lesson is don't let the politician choose the entire frame without noticing when they chose it, or at least noticing that they chose it. If they want to talk about immigration, fine. Ask about immigration, but then ask about detention and due process and private contractors and who gets picked up and what happens when the government makes the mistake and all the other problems that exist underneath the slogan. And then ask whether law and order means the same thing when a criminal has money, access, or friends in the administration, and watch the second question. Watch if they want to talk about voter fraud, what fraud, where, how many votes, what evidence, which prosecution, which court, what changed in the result. And a follow-up question is where the slogan either develops muscles or folds like a lawn chair. That's why I think Republican coverage between now and November is going to be fascinating. Not because Republicans will suddenly stop supporting Trump. That's virtually an impossibility. And certainly not because Democrats are guaranteed some gigantic blue wave. I don't think there's anything guaranteed in politics, but because Republican candidates are going to be forced to perform this very strange act over and over and over again. Praise Trump, defend Trump, need Trump, avoid Trump. I wouldn't want to be in their shoes. At some point, you start wondering whether the campaign brochure should just say, please select the version of me most appropriate for your demographic. And the more uncomfortable the underlying environment becomes, the more tempting the tennis balls become. That's what I'll be watching. Not simply whether Republicans talk about communism. I mean, I know they're going to talk about communism. Not simply whether they talk about trans issues or election fraud. I know they're going to talk about all those things. But I'm going to watch when those subjects appear, what comes right before them, what question they replaced, and whether anyone in the room had the balls to say, okay, but you still didn't answer me. That's where this whole thing gets interesting. So let's go back to the stage one more time. Our Republican candidate is still standing there, still smiling, still juggling. The tennis balls are flying. Communism, trans athletes, voter fraud, crime, immigration, up and around and up and around. And, mixed among them are those other knives. Trump at 33%, Iran, prices, the House, the Senate, MAGA, swing voters, defending Trump. Don't make the election about Trump. All I could say is good luck, guys, good luck. And every few minutes, some strategist runs onto the stage with another tennis ball. Here, talk about woke schools. Here, talk about socialism. So on and so on. And when Donald Trump walks out from behind the curtain holding something shiny, campaign manager looks up and says, no. Trump smiles, no. And Trump throws more knives. And somehow the candidate has to catch him, keep everything else moving, look directly at the camera, and tell you everything is going beautifully. That is the Republican midterm campaign right now. And over the next 11 weeks, I do not want you to ignore the tennis balls. As I said, some of them matter. But when one suddenly flies across your screen, remember that there are other things still in the air. Listen to what Republican candidates want to talk about and listen to what they don't want to talk about. When somebody asks about Iran and you get communism, notice it. When somebody asks about Trump and you get transgender athletes, notice it. On and on and on. The first answer may tell you what the campaign wants you to be thinking about. The follow-up may tell you what they are trying desperately not to discuss. So between now and November, watch the pivot, watch the second question, and whatever else they throw into the act, keep your eye on those knives. All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for taking the time to download and listen to this episode from your neighbor on the left. I am thrilled that you did, and I would love to hear from you, whether it's DMs through social media or the email address that I mentioned at the top of the episode. You can find all these on the website, neighboronyourleft.com. I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear what you think about this or what you think about anything that we talk about on this podcast. I would love to hear from you. I'll be back on Friday with another Back Porch Files installment of Your Neighbor on the Left. So between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.